Welcome, everyone. We're going to be beginning in just a few moments as everyone continues logging on. Hello, my name is Grace Coleman, and I'm the president and CEO of Crisis Center North, a domestic violence counseling and educational resource center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to the Keystone Link seminar on cross-reporting for human and humane services, a deep dive into elder and animal abuse. Today, we are going to be joined by some amazing speakers who have some wonderful information to share with us. But before I do their brief bios, I'd like to do a few housekeeping details. I'd like to let all of you know that you are joined today by members of the Keystone Link, many whom are on the call. A special shout out to Kristen Tulo from the Pennsylvania State Humane Society, and also Kathleen Palm, the founder of the Center for Children's Justice, who helped found the Keystone Link. Also, we are indebted to Liz Caruso and Jennifer Clark at Talkie Tech for all of the work that they're doing and bringing the seminar to us, as well as Vicki Denzer, who is of the Animal Welfare Institute, an Ohio representative, who has done a lot in terms of our marketing to bring us all together today for this fascinating discussion. So back to our speakers. We're going to be joined today by Jessica Bebo, who's done extensive research on elders and their pets and the interrelationship between elders and the pets and the positive outcomes that can come from that. We're also going to be joined by Janet Hoy Gerlach. Janet is a licensed clinical social worker, researcher, author, and the director of the veterinary social work at Open Door Veterinary Collective, a national nonprofit that works to increase to access veterinary care and related supports needed by people and their pets. And last, but certainly not least, is Mary Rotkus. Mary is a research associate faculty member at the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh. And we are looking forward to her insights as a former Fulbright scholar and a Fulbright specialist in today's presentation. I'm hoping all of you will enjoy this as much as we have enjoyed putting it together. Thank you.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Mary Beth Roctus, and I'm going to get us started. And then I will be the person who actually ends our talk today. So we'll get started on the next slide. So we're just going to talk about the benefits and challenges of pet ownership in older adulthood. And I have to start my video. Okay. And hi, everyone. And also the issues encountered by APS professionals. Yes, this is going to be recorded. We're going to talk about working with older pet owners, social work perspective, and I do have a guide that we can make available for you specific to the Pittsburgh region, but definitely can be customized for wherever you are in the United States. Cross-reporting, mandated reporting, collaboration across sectors, and resources. So we have a lot to accomplish today, so we'll move along. We wanted to start today's discussion by some situations. So I'll take a few minutes to let you look, just a few seconds to let you look at this. But this was a situation that I encountered as a volunteer for an animal shelter and also for a cat rescue. So we were asked to go in, and when we went in, we found someone who had some cognitive disturbance around beliefs about the cats. The cats were in the basement. They were in very bad shape. She relinquished the cats to us because remember, animals are considered to be under Pennsylvania law property. And the question that the shelter, that the animal staff who did this rescue said, well, what do we do about Mrs. M? We're very concerned about her. From what they could see, she was really having a difficult time functioning in her home, and they, of course, their responsibility were the animals, but they were also very concerned about her. So next slide, we have actually a case that I've been doing some research looking at the involuntary commitment records in Allegheny County going back about a decade. And about, I would say about 3% of them, not a large percent, but still concerning, involve animals in the commitment procedure, animals being abused or neglected. Not necessarily older adults, but nonetheless, abuse and neglect. So you can see there's a individual here with a head injury. So there's a lot of problems with emotional regulation. He's living with his partner of many years. She has a dog, two dogs that she considers, she's very close to. She considers them emotional support animals, although Janet will talk about what that designation really means. And during times when he's very dysregulated, he will threaten her, he'll threaten the dogs, or when he wants money, he threatens to kidnap the dogs and hold them until sort of as hostages until she capitulates to his demands for money. And this actually comes out when the adult protective service worker comes out to do some routine paperwork. Next slide is about something that we see a lot and certainly showed up a lot in the involuntary commitment records. What we looked at is a case of an older adult who lives alone, who's socially isolated. A family member comes to visit or hears about, and they walk into a home that even 6 months ago was fine, that now is just, it's very clear they're not taking care of themselves, and there are animals involved. In this case, it was birds. And the birds, as you can see, they have health problems, and they've obviously not been taken care of. Mrs. K goes to the hospital for a full assessment, but what happens to the birds, right? So, and then the very last case is one that I deal with a lot actually in my work with a cat rescue, which is community cat caregiving, which seems to be something we see a lot with older women, but actually also some men. And this is a case of Mr. E, who lives in a trailer area, and his trailer is unheated, and he's caring for a colony of about 20 cats. He needs help with trapping, neutering, releasing them. But when the rescue goes there, they find out that he has no heat. He has limited food. He has a family member with a drug and alcohol problem who comes in and out of the home. And so while she can help with trapping and releasing, which of course is what she was called to do, she's very concerned about him and the fact that winter's, approaching and he has no heating in this trailer. So, and this comes through, sort of a Facebook page where all the rescues tend to communicate with each other and share resources. So I've given you a couple common scenarios that you may also see in your work. We'll circle back to them, but we wanted to wanted to start off saying this isn't something that, it's something that you face in your work. It's something, if you work with animals, you're facing, if you work with people, you're facing, if you volunteer, if you teach, we see this. And now the question is, okay, so what next? So I'm gonna go off video and I'm gonna let Jess take over from this point on.
Hi. Thanks, Mary. So my name is Jess Bibbo, and I am a senior research scientist at Benjamin Rose Institute on Aging in Cleveland, Ohio. So I am not a Pennsylvanian, but I am just a neighbor to your Commonwealth. So I want to start by talking about really what's the root of all of this, and it's the human-animal bond. And it's easy to think of the bond as simply our affinity or our love for animals, but it's actually much richer than that. The human-animal bond is dynamic and it's also bidirectional. So it's really a relationship between a human and a non-human. And those are affected by changes every, day-to-day changes and situational changes. And a lot of what we'll be talking about, and certainly the scenarios that Mary just described, really highlight how the bond is impacted by resources available, people's environment, and their own health and well-being. And it's important also that the bond is also, it affects the health and well-being of both the person and that non-human animal. And we often conceptualize it, and right now we will too, as companion animals or pets. So pets and healthy aging, a lot of you've probably heard about, having pets is good for your blood pressure. Um, but it's not that simple. And really the only effect that seems to be consistent in literature is the impact of dog walking. Um, and that's not to say that pets are bad for your health, but there's just not that strong evidence. What there is stronger evidence for is the impact of pets on our psychological health and well-being. Um, and pets really impart companionship because that's what they are. That's why we call them companion animals. Um, and they also can help to mitigate loneliness. I know that was talked about a lot during 2020 and continues to be. And we often think of loneliness as something that is more part of older adults' lives, but that's a common misconception. Loneliness is unfortunately common throughout adulthood. It's not just something that impacts older people. Um, and one thing that pets do give to people or provide is really a sense of purpose and that need to be needed. And I think that example of someone caring for a colony of cats is a great example of this. That gentleman is doing it because he's able to provide and feel connected to and be contributing to. And that need to be needed, it doesn't go away simply because you have a lot of birthdays. It is very important to us as people. And that's something that is very helpful from pet ownership, especially when people's abilities change. And especially if you're at a part of life where you are becoming increasingly dependent on others, having a relationship that is still dependent on you is very meaningful and very important. And then also social determinants of health. So the resources available to a person are the resources that are available to their pet too. So again, with that human animal bond, it's going to impact both the person and the pet. And then there's also that bidirectional where pet ownership can impact resources. A great example is housing. Being a pet owner can make a lot of housing, especially low income housing, just not available. It's not as available as it is for people who can, own their own home. And fortunately, this is being explored more and more in the literature, the impact of social determinants of health and how they impact not just a person in the home, but conceptualizing family as everyone in the home. That includes, the birds and the cats and the dogs as well. And so these are just some examples, one of which is by Mary, our co-presenter, on how these social determinants of health really are bidirectional. And just a little bit more on healthy aging. Healthy aging is not just outcomes, right? It's not just your physical health, psychological health, social health, emotional health. It's also having agency in your decisions and being able to live according to your own values and what's important to you as a person throughout your life. And we see pets impact people's decision making, especially when it comes to healthcare. And health behaviors that need to be needed, that giving purpose and routine that pets can give to daily life can be very important, very motivating for people. And I know that Janet's going to speak about this too. And so we also see some while it can be positive and help people maintain health behaviors like walking and taking care of themselves, sticking to a routine, there can be also a more negative side where people may choose to stay in situations that aren't as positive or decide to go and not receive health care because they want to stay home with a pet. And very quickly, I just want to say that there is growing evidence that pets also impact caregivers. And this is the work that they do, the emotional part of caregiving. And what's most important, I think, in this talk today is how pets, a client's pets, can impact healthcare and service professionals. Um, and we'll talk more about how pets can be a way to build rapport, to build open communication, but also to just allow someone to better understand the risks and benefits to health and really a person's entire situation if you ask about pets. So along this issue, there hasn't been a great deal of research. And so in 2020, I conducted a study in partnership with our local GWEP, which is the Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Program funded by HRSA. And this allowed me to sample a really great interdisciplinary sample of people working with older adults, persons living with dementia, as well as caregivers. And really, what I wanted to see, this was a one-time online survey. As you can imagine, everything was online because it was 2020. And the main, the first aim of this study was really to know how many people had encountered issues stemming from pet ownership of their clients. How often is this encountered? And then also, what are those issues? Who reports those issues? And what are the specific, benefits and challenges that people have seen, not just for older adults, but also for caregivers, and then also for the professionals themselves. What impact has there been on them? And then finally, taking all this information and making guides that professionals can use. So it's a lot, and I don't have that much time, and there's a lot more to talk about. So real briefly, this was the sample, and we did have about 12% that were connected with APS. And so I'm going to talk about some of the findings with APS compared to non-APS folks. And that question about how many people and what did they see, that's available in an open access journal article that I will link to in the chat when I'm done chatting. But our high level findings were that although almost 80% of professionals had encountered some kind of pet issue, so that's a lot, that's the majority for sure. And that basic pet care, that day-to-day need of basic tasks and caring for a pet was the biggest challenge people faced. Pardon me, who brought up what issue really varied between if it was the person was the pet owner, the caregiver, or the professional themselves. And what's really important for this presentation is that people who entered the homes were much more likely to encounter pet issues. And so in terms of asking about pet ownership, APS folks were much more likely to ask about pet ownership routinely, as opposed to people who were not APS. And this may be because APS folks go into homes. And it also may be because they go into homes that they're more likely to see that the whole environment of an individual. And when we look at the benefits that people provided in those open-ended items, there was a lot of this. It was very similar between the two, right? With companionship and purpose of a pet being what both groups really saw. And this is really encapsulated by this one quote that pets give them, meaning the older adult, a purpose, emotional support, keeps them busy, occupied, calming, keeps them active. And when we were looking at drawbacks from pet ownership, these were also similar in that basic care, financial, veterinary waste, all those really instrumental parts of pet ownership and also the ones that tap into available resources, right? Money, transportation has to do with veterinary care. Um, and then one thing that was a little bit different here is that you can kind of see how APS folks were a bit more aware of person's environment. So this unsanitary, that's what unsanitary was. It was really most often pet waste accumulating in the home. And again, that can only be seen if you really are going into the home. And so when we look at the drawbacks, people not recognizing that they're unable to care for the pet. We saw that a lot in when people talked about individuals with dementia, that there was this unintentional neglect that could occur simply because people were unaware of changes and unaware of needs. And also, people can be physically not able to care for their pets, causing bad home conditions, requiring the adult to get evicted or be removed from the home. And then there's no set plan to place or take the animals. So I'm wrapping up, but these are our additional findings, which were that APS also were more often encountered people refusing to seek medical care or move because of a pet. And this could also be because, APS professionals, they are, they take no for an answer in a way that a lot of other professions don't tend to. People are allowed to make their choices. And so that could be part of it. And they also were more often said that they encountered legal issues, especially related to housing, like evictions that was mentioned in that last quote. And finally, both groups said that they saw a need for pet care, that people need help with pet care in their home, and that assisting with pet care would have benefits not just for the people in the home, but also the pets in the home. So these two quotes, I think that the last one is really sums it up, in that a lot of seniors will make poor decisions to remain in a poor state because there's no plan for the pet. And what this really gets back to is people needing to plan for a pet, and that pets, and Janet will talk about this more too, but pets need to be part of conversations. You cannot have a plan unless you really have those conversations and you have those discussions. And so when we talk to people about things like, what is your plan for if you need to go to a hospital, if you need to move? Pets need to be part of that because very often they are part of the internal decision-making process for pet owners, but they're not often expressed aloud. And so if we ask about that, that means we're also acknowledging the importance of pets in people's lives. And that also makes people feel heard, and that can help build rapport and trust with the people we work with. And so I will make these available. This is the guide that we created. There's also a guide for working with caregivers of pet owners, and I can make those available, and I will pass it to Janet.
Okay, thank you so much, Jess, for giving us that overview. That is seriously cutting edge research in this area. And I'll be talking with you through the next section. Next slide. So I wanted to start just briefly by sharing with you how I came to be even here talking with you about this particular topic. As was mentioned in my intro, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so I've been practicing for a few decades now. A big chunk of that was in community mental health and primarily with older adults. I also, one of my, very early jobs for a few years was a job in which I did crisis intervention and risk assessment, in particular suicide and lethality, much like, Resolve in Pittsburgh, and there's other, settings like that across the country. And one question that, as a person doing a suicide risk assessment with someone, one question that we always asked, that I still ask, it's not my question, I can't take credit for it. It's what was taught to me by my supervisor in doing risk assessments. The question being, what's stopped you up until now from acting on your suicidal thoughts and plan? And we got the kinds of responses that, I've been taught in my social work education, my supervision, my continuing education, things like, I can't do that to my family, my kids, my grandkids, or, would hurt my friends. It's against my faith belief, or, faith community kinds of reasons. However, often enough that it gave me pause, no pun intended, and not just me, but with my colleagues, were the folks that were saying, I haven't acted. The reason I'm alive talking to you is because of my pet. And there were two things about that. The first being, as a quote unquote animal person, I totally got it, that you could be that, attached and connected to your animal. That made sense to me on like a personal level. As a clinician, it hit me, wow, like nowhere in my training, anywhere has folks ever mentioned pets, let alone talked about how, as social workers and social service professionals, how we might engage with somebody around that, help support them in keeping, their animal with them as long as possible. So that really got my wheels turning. And went from there to academe, climbed Professor Mountain, was a full professor appointment in psychiatry, done a lot of work around, people and companion animals and their benefits. But it really started with suicide assessment and realizing that the relationship with a pet can help keep people alive. Conversely, and we'll talk more about this, it can also be a barrier to people being safe if they have to choose between their pet and their safety or their well-being. Many folks will choose their pet. Next slide. So this is a question, just I talked about the bond that we have with the animals. In this pair, we'll do a little poll here. Which do you think first met, pair on the left or pair on the right? And which do you think has been together over 12 years? Let's take a moment. And I wouldn't even know just looking at this necessarily. You might be more observant than, I am, but even, doing work in this field for years and years, both pairs look pretty darn happy in each other's company.
Liz, this is Grace. I was wondering if you could enable the vote because host and panelists currently cannot vote.
That's just for the panelists, but the attendees are able to vote right now. They're voting. Let me see if we can get it for you as well.
Sorry, that's the message up. Thank you, Liz.
So one of these two has been together 12 years. The other pair literally met as like with probably the picture was taken within like 60 seconds of them meeting. So let's see our results. Okay, so looks like a bit more pair on the right, and you are correct. I completely see, however, those of you who picked the pair on the left, because they, both look delighted with each other's company. So what we're seeing here is that, our companion animals, dogs, cats who've evolved to live with us humans can be very connective very immediately. So the pair on the left is an animal assisted therapy interaction where he just met this dog jumped in his lap, he's delighted, or from his facial expression at least. Pair on the right has been together almost the dog's whole life, and dog lives with him, and they have an ongoing relationship. So called the human animal bond. On the left, human animal interaction with a therapy animal. Both are very beneficial and have ways that they can be of support to older adults. However, as social workers and human service professionals, my experience has been that we do much more around the left side than the right. So what we're going to talk about today is the right side, which is, many more people have animals who they live with rather than have animal assisted therapy. Next slide. Okay, one more poll, just to kind of connect with your experiences as folks, with knowledge and expertise and around older adult support. How many of you have you worked with an older adult who has had concerns about their pets? Worries, stress? I know Jess has some wonderful national data for us. And looks like in our group, 79% of you have had an older adult who has had concerns around their pets, and about 21% have not. So it sounds like for most of you, you've had experiences around this that give you some knowledge. Excellent. Next slide. Well, not excellent that they've had concerns, but that you've had the opportunity to build some understanding. This is a question. I'm not an animal assisted therapist or animal person. I've had many folks, social service, healthcare providers, social workers that are like, it's really, neat that you are interested in, human animal supports, but I'm not in, animal assisted. I don't do that. So why should I be asking about it? Answer. Next slide. Risks, strengths. So these are both areas I mentioned, the protection against suicidality. I didn't talk about that article, that research article, actually, that was a quality Australia that came out about older adults talking about how their pets helped impede them from acting on suicidality. That came out in 2020 in March. So it got no news coverage or traction. We all know what was happening then. I think if that had come out at a different time, that would have made a bit of a media splash. That's quite a powerful thing to build on. But numerous other ways we'll take a look at. And then risks, I talked about the example of people living for their pets. People are also willing to risk their lives. I was talking with, he's the CEO at Humane, Michigan, I believe in Detroit. His name is Matt Pepper. He used to be an emergency responder. And in Katrina, one of his roles was to go in and recover bodies. And he found numerous people with their animals right with them. And unfortunately, Katrina was the catalyst for, federal, FEMA funding being attached to, you have to have a plan for your pets for states and municipalities to get it, because so many people refused to evacuate, and some did pass holding their animals and were found that way. So, lesser risks, but not quite that dramatic, might be, refusing care, hospitalization, safe shelter versus staying on the street. Next slide. So how do we address this if it's not something that we observe? As Jess mentioned, if we're not in the homes, we may not have an opportunity to observe this. And if the person doesn't bring it up, and many times it's not what people would think to talk about with a human service provider, because it's a quote unquote animal issue. 3 questions. These have come from practitioners and folks, domestic violence in particular, across the country has probably, in terms of human service areas, been the forerunner in terms of being aware of animal relationships, because of the risk of folks delaying leaving abusive situations. But this is really something that can be modified and put in just about any intake. Do you live with any animals? Are they helpful for you? If so, how? This is where you find opportunities to perhaps build on that in terms of your care and your support with somebody. Do they have any worries? And if so, what? And I know once you ask that, then it's in your lap, and okay, now what do I do? I'm not an animal expert, not an animal professional. I stay in my lane, which is absolutely right. We don't want to move out of our scope of practice, but I have some resources and supports for you that, if you get the issues. And I love that. Yes, Maria. Another reason, maybe they don't live with any animals, but they would like to. And there are some wonderful, like, seniors adopting seniors, or long-term pet fostering program where all the expenses for the animals are covered. There's different resources that our animal welfare colleagues have where we can help connect a person. Thank you so much for that comment. Next slide. So how are people benefited, or how can relationships with animals be quote unquote therapeutic? If we look at this picture on the right, I'm going to put out there, I don't know for certain, but I'm going to say that I don't think that cat was trained to do that cute little nuzzle. If we look at her face, I think most of us would agree she's having a meaningful experience here. She being the woman, I don't know. For the cat. So this is an example of what we would call a natural benefit, the top bullet. These are the biological, psychological, social, emotional benefits of human-animal interaction. So a bonded pair, the pair on the right that we looked at, been together 12 years, and just meeting. My mom is in a nursing home and loves the animals, and was telling me about the therapy dog Hercules, giant, goodness, I can't remember the breed, but that was the most she talked when we were visiting. She's having a lot of confusion, trouble finding her words, but like that, she clicked right in. And that's, one anecdotal situation, but there's a lot of reports of that. And again, the piece is, it's the presence of the animal. It's the interactions that the person has as they live with the animal that convey the benefits. We'll look at those. There's not training necessary. That cat might be that woman's cat in this picture we're looking at, and this might be that. You'll say Kitty's named Kitty. Kitty might only like her, but you know what? For this pair, that works. I mean, unless maybe somebody needs to help her get Kitty to the vet. I mean, there's it's not perfect, but in terms of the woman getting benefits, this cat does not need to be a therapy cat who can interact with any human that crosses her path. So it's everyday companion animals. They have their quirks, and maybe don't like people with beards, or all sorts of idiosyncrasies, but if they're bonded with their person, there is the potential for these kinds of benefits. Task trained, This is when the animal learns specific tasks. This is what we would consider service animals, specific tasks that help a person function and help support them with a chronic health or disability condition. So seeing eye dogs were the first, hearing impairment help, mobility, people that maybe can't reach things, a whole range. Now there's epilepsy and diabetes alert animals that can smell changes, and psychiatric service animals who are trained to do things. They can they're taught to recognize when their person is maybe experiencing a flashback, and they learned grounding, which is maybe leaning against the person's leg. Nightmares, they can wake a person up, they can turn the lights on, they can lay their paws over somebody to ground them. So again, an animal might do some of that on their own, probably not the lights turning on, but some of the other things maybe, but they don't know, that's more just affiliative, intuitive. Whereas task trained animals, these are our assistance animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide. So what are the benefits? And Jess has given us a nice overview. Again, this isn't at the level of randomized controlled clinical trial, evidence-based practice, but this is what is represented in the research literature. Each of these have some support. So there's physical, psychological, social, emotional. Next slide. So physical, I just wanted to highlight here, there's two types. There's activity, which I think probably most of us think of, like walking, even fine motor skills, playing, grooming, which is why animals are included in physical and occupational therapy as motivators for somebody to engage in, things that help their motor skills. Contact related. This is related to oxytocin release. That's the bonding hormone that was discovered in breastfeeding studies. And then skin to skin, so babies laying on parents' bare skin helped promote oxytocin release, which it creates, that warm, fuzzy feel good. Plus it lowers heart rate, respiration rate, blood pressure. In 2013, the American Heart Association, that's the picture on the left, released a statement about cardiovascular benefits of pets. 2023, they released a national public health education campaign called Healthy Bond for Life, with information about how to be more intentional on our interactions with pets in ways that can promote both of these kinds of benefits. So, again, American Heart Association, this is a very mainstream, the public education arm for cardiology, heart practice, actually created to disseminate research. So it's being increasingly looked at as an important support for people. Next slide. Psychological roles here. I'll let you look at these. I want to highlight what's called, behavior activation and mental health. More simply put, motivation. And Mary, who got us started and is going to close us out, actually did research on food insecurity and found that the hypothesis was folks with pets would have more food insecurity because they were sharing with their pets. But when she surveyed people in a number of food banks, found it was the opposite. People had less. And she fortunately had qualitative surveys. What she found was people were less willing to let their pets run out of food than themselves. So they would come for the pet food, and then it would be like, hey Janet, so we got Fluffy's food. Do you need some? How are you doing? And then that commitment to the animal's well-being would essentially be a bridge for them. In my own research, I found very similarly, people living with serious mental illness, chronic mental illness, and their animals would talk about, well, since I have my animal, I take my medicine, I'm keeping my appointments, because if I end up back in the hospital, who's going to look after my animal? And even with foster animal programs, temporary, that would look after their animal, they were still telling me, I had multiple people talking about, that's going to stress my animal. They don't, taking them someplace. And then on the left is some real interesting emerging studies around how having a pet has some association around protecting protecting against cognitive decline. I wanted to use the right words here. So a couple of studies, that's an interesting direction that it's heading. So again, these are documented in the research. Next slide. Emotional, I think this is probably what most of us think of. Well-being feelings, the animal provides comfort, affection, and reduced feelings of loneliness. We know loneliness with the social determinants of health is increasingly recognized as a risk factor. Does an animal replace a human relationship? Of course not. Do they offer things that could potentially, be protective? They do, and there's some studies here that begin to outline that for us. Next slide. Social benefits break into two. There's the direct. This is the animal, like we see the woman celebrating her 90th birthday with her cat. Companionship. The animal themselves is providing the companionship. Indirect is that bridge effect. You see two people looking at a cell phone, pictures of the animals, having a conversation about animals. Dog walking and people getting smiled at more, talked to more when they have their dog. Kitty in the window phenomena. People with their kitty in the window being approached by other cat friendly neighbors in an apartment building, or even there was a city that had like a cat window walk where people were invited to, I don't know how, they probably catnip and cat toys, but somehow put your kitty in the window and everybody could see kitties. Very interesting. But so both of these are social benefits and all of these, as we go through, just sort of, these are things you can be looking for to build on when you're working with somebody that has an animal. Next slide. Okay, therapeutic. So there's different roles animals have, and people use these terms kind of interchangeably, and they're actually substantially different. So on the far right, service animals, they have extensive training to be in public without being stressed out, and then to do the tasks that a person needs that help that person with their health condition or mental health condition that is impairing. So we see a dog guiding a person across the street. The person has a visual impairment. I adore my dogs. If they took me in a street and I was not able to see, I can tell you it would not go well. That is a very highly trained animal. In the middle is therapy animal. So middle, and then on the left, we have pets and emotional support animals. Both of you can see are laying on their people or the person. In the middle, like the pair that was on the left that we first saw, they just met. But you can see she's, smiling. But therapy dogs, they're not doing specific tasks, but they're taking that presence and they're visiting people who may be, vulnerable or going through a trauma. So everything from school shootings, hospital, nursing home, school. They may go with a handler who's volunteer and bringing the animal. They may be a person animal, and that person is a therapist, a clinician, and they actually do, they help with the therapy session through the natural benefits. And therapy animals are registered by a national organization. They have to pass an evaluation. And then on the far left are our pets and our emotional support animals. Pets, you could see these two laying together. With just looking at them, we would not know if this was a pet or an ESA. What makes the difference? It's not what the animal's doing, it's what the animal's doing, the impact that it has on that person. If he's like in the middle of about to have a panic attack and his dog laying against him is helping to calm him, And that happens frequently, that he can touch, pet his dog, and that helps reduce, and he has panic disorder or another mental health condition, that would qualify as an emotional support animal. The relationship with the animal, the presence, is helping to reduce the stress and impairment around the condition. But the animal's not taught to do anything fancy. Pets are our companion animals. They live with us and we get benefits, that are helpful. So just some reference points here. Next slide. Actually, ESAs are no longer permitted in airports. They are recognized under the Fair Housing Act, but not that they're not permitted in airports. They're no longer recognized as an accommodation under the Air Carrier Access Act. So that has been eliminated in terms of people, trying to keep their animals out of the cargo hold and not have to pay a cabin fee. This is an example of somebody living with a cat, and I won't read it to you, but you see at the top, she's talking about depressed episode or exhaustion. She's having what's called leaden paralysis. That's just the term for arms and legs being super heavy, draggy feeling. Her cat, Ernest Hemingway, great title, oh my goodness gracious, name, sits on her, touches her with a paw. The weight, the purring, the presence helps, I'm putting a clinical term on here, ground her. And when he leaves, she is actually able to get up too. It's helped to reduce her impairment. And again, he's not trained to do this. This is just him doing cat stuff. But the impact on her, is very significant. Next slide. So everyday untrained cat behaviors, there they are. Next slide. ESAs, again, they're essentially no different than pets. It's how they impact a person. Under the Fair Housing Act, a person has a right to have their animal with them as an accommodation if the animal, through their presence and companionship and everyday interactions, helps to reduce impairment or symptoms. Next slide. ESA letter to write them. Person must have a condition that qualifies. It's a pretty low bar, and I will send you materials. But for example, major depressive disorder, if you meet that criteria, actually that is automatically considered eligible under the HUD memo that came out to guide people around this. So it's not an extensive disability evaluation like Social Security or workers' comp. And is the animal helpful for the person? Are they telling you, like that blurb with Ernest Hemingway we looked at? Do they have a history? Maybe they're not living with an animal currently, but historically the animal's been helpful. Next slide. And there are 3 free on-demand webinars through Open Door that you can get to from our social work page. So if you type in, Open Door, social work and pets in your, search, or Google or whichever that you use, you'll see emotional support animals. Click on that. And these are 3.5-hour trainings. The first one's a 101, and then the other 2 get into more details. Next slide. GER method. This is simply being intentional about the benefits of animals for their people when a person's having a stress response. So we're hardwired to go up into fight, flight, or to freeze. These are our brain's ways of trying to keep us safe. When we get those repeatedly, or if we get stuck in those, or if somebody has a mental health condition that is, reactive, like generalized anxiety, panic disorder, PTSD, or a health condition where they're very stressed. With aging, there's a lot of losses that we go through with functioning in life. The GER method is about, ways physically that we can engage with our animal to ground ourselves, how the relationship with the animal being able to hold that, and work with that in ways to calm ourselves, and then reframing, basically talking aloud to our animal rather than thinking in our head when we're trying to do, sort of the cognitive reframing. Oh my gosh, that person, my coworker walked by and didn't say hi. They're angry at me. Okay, Janet, actually, maybe are they, they didn't see you, they're having a bad day, they're stressed. I might be thinking this if I'm doing GUR method, I'm reframing out loud to my dog who loves when I talk to him. So it's a win-win, but it's just capturing existing coping skills that have good evidence and bringing our animal relationship into that. Next slide.
Janet, before you leave that, there's a question of what would not be considered a diagnosis for ESA?
The diagnoses is, it's broad because the Fair Housing Act is anti-discrimination law. So its purpose is to ensure that people are able to live in housing with the supports they need. So even if the person has, a condition, let's say depressive disorder unspecified, that's like DSM-5 language for, that yes, they have depression, it's causing them, distress or impairment, not sure what exactly, is the cause. That's a very general, broad diagnosis. If it was causing struggle for the person around, their daily functioning or ongoing pattern of distress that the animal's presence or interactions helped to reduce, that would be somebody who's eligible. So the automatic conditions are just to make it that much easier for people who are verifying that the person is eligible. We also want to be sure we stay in our lane, that we're not writing anything about this animal, Fluffy or Ernest Hemingway is a great ESA, but just that they have some samples letters. I mean, unless you're also like a veterinary or animal behavior professional, what we do is we're verifying, yes, the person has the condition that's causing distress or impairment for them ongoing. So it's not like a single episode, it's chronic. And yes, the animal is or would be expected to, is expected to, if it doesn't have one yet, help to alleviate the distress and impairment. So those are the two pieces. So there's quite a bit of flexibility with the diagnosis. Next slide. Thank you. Great question. And we're getting more resources. Pet Help Finder. This is like 211 for pets. I did a training for the National 211 Steering Committee, and they're using Pet Help Finder. But this resource has temporary foster care for pets, affordable vet care, pet food and supplies are the three main areas. So you search for your area. If you can't find the resource that you need, you can always email Pet Help Finder. This is through United Way, Open Door, the organization I work for. And this was created to help link people with pets to supports that they need, so that the people are not in a situation where they have to choose between the pet and their well-being. Next slide. Transportation. Uber has started U-Transport. This Geraldine, her email's there and we'll get that to you, but that actually is a program that Uber has created to help reduce transportation barriers. Next slide. Best B&B partners with organizations, so hospitals, elder care resources, community mental health centers, and they do temporary foster homes. They build a fostering network in the community, they screen, they do background checks, and they have a whole HIPAA compliant system that they use so that people, if they go to an emergency room, they don't have to pick between, yes, I'll be admitted and I don't, I have to surrender my pet, or no, I won't be admitted, but then I'm not treated, but my pet will be okay. I can go care for them. Next slide. And finally, what we're talking about here, there's actually a name for it. One Health has historically been used to talk about the connect between human and animal disease. So COVID, how was that spread? And, did it go from animals to humans? Polluted water makes animals sick, makes us sick. So it looks at the connections between people, animal, and environments. However, we're moving out of just disease to how does well-being get improved for people, for animals, and the communities that they live in when we're looking at outcomes for people and animals. And an example of that is there's a clinic in Pittsburgh that offers veterinary care, which much like the pet food study, people come for their animals, but then there's human health services. People tend to decline those and ask for the vet services. So having a very engaging health service provider that initially connects with them to do their intake and talks with them before the vet service has actually helped in other states with this approach to get folks caring for themselves and their animals, but the relationship is the motivating factor. And I went over, I apologize, but I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Okay, no problem. So hi, it's me again. Happy to take us to the end. So that's my cat Chauncey Peanut there, who's always in my face. He's just a very affectionate cat. All right, so next slide, please. So I'm just going to take us out talking a little bit about where we are with laws both in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So Ohio, the great state of Ohio, in 2021 signed into law a bill that requires veterinarians, social service professionals, and counselors who encounter abused companion animals to report their observations to law enforcement or animal control. And law enforcement and animal control officers then must notify social service professionals if a child or a senior resides with an alleged animal abuser. And one of the things I heard from Vicki, who's on this call, as they investigate how this rollout has gone in Ohio, it's great to have a law and it's great to have training, but given the turnover in workforce these days, the training needs to be continually refreshed, right? So we can't just spray everyone with training and pray it sticks. What we need to do is continue the training and always remember that the workforce is turning over at a faster rate than we've probably ever seen before. So we need to keep it up. So next slide, please. In Pennsylvania, we're not quite there yet. So several bills are in the House and in the Senate that are around the human animal intersection. They generally tend to be more focused on domestic violence in custody and divorce as opposed to seniors. None of the bills are necessarily focused yet, although I think there may be one that might be making its way through the House or the Senate right now. So next slide. So what can we do? So this comes from Phil. I know Phil is on the call. So Phil, this comes from your August newsletter. So the Administration for Community Living finally has their final rule putting out adult protective services. But unfortunately, they failed to include references to companion or service animals. I would also say emotional support animals who might be collateral damage in the acts of abuse against elderly and disabled. So the final rule gets us closer to protecting older adults, but not their beloved companions. So next slide, please. And so this also comes from the National Link Coalition. Thank you, Phil. In which there's suggestions in the absence of clear guidelines from the feds or from your state. And most of what happens in animal protection actually is coming from the states. There are federal laws that apply to animal experimentation and medical research, but much of which, and I think I'm right in saying this, Vicki, you can always correct me later or correct us, correct, put a clarification in. But when it comes to pets, most of that is determined state by state, not unlike child welfare, which is actually where I came from. So program administrators, there are things that we can still do within our own agencies. We don't have to wait for a state law to get moving on this. We can create policies and protocols. We can promote collaboration. So the shelter that I volunteer with, they often ask me for, help. And now they have an MSW student, so I'm pretty excited about that. So now they sort of have an expert now in sort of care management, hopefully on board. Receiving reports of maltreatment. I mean, we should have a standardized system. We don't necessarily have that. But again, if you're an adult protective service worker, I don't know why it says responding to this report, but there should be a standard question, as Jess mentioned. People who go in the home mention this, but this isn't necessarily standard for people who are talking on the phone. So asking questions about pets in the home, you're still staying in your lane. You're still doing protective services, but you are also asking, just as you might ask about the presence of children in the home, and conducting the investigation, the criticality and safety and the environmental conditions, including the presence of abused, dangerous, or hoarded animals in the home, again, should be part of the protocol for. You don't, as I said, don't need a law to be able to do this. And people say, and next slide, oh, but isn't that like getting out of my lane? No, actually, I would say, as someone who has done child protective service work, not older adults, that your lane is actually pretty broad, because in my case, those animals are important to the child. And so that widens my lane a bit. I got a little bit of a passing side there. So I would say adult protective workers should always have a set of tools inclusive, so that the assessments include the presence of animals in the home. And you know a little bit about some of the things you've heard today. So you know about the food security issue. Excuse me. You know about and we could do a whole thing on hoarding, but how to respond. And hoarding is, like I said, that's a whole other kind of webinar, but fairly common, and one that actually takes a requires a multi-agency approach, which is what I talk about. And I'm a big fan of mandated cross-reporting between animal welfare and human welfare, whether it's a child, whether it's older adults. We know how important those animals are to our target group. And so I think it's really important that we think about our lane as having some passing lines, and that we don't think that we, like, as I had a student once say to me when I said, well, when they took the children out of the home, were there any pets in the home? And he's a great student. He looked at me, he's like, why would that be my role? And I was like, well, if you're working with those children, then those pets belong to those children, and that is important to them, and that is your role. So next slide, please. Keeping in mind, we want to leave about 15 minutes. So this takes us back to sort of these scenarios, which are based on real circumstances. So I would ask you, as you read about Mrs. M again, think about how you have handled cases like this, and would you do anything differently? As I mentioned, the rescue, the shelter, said to me, what should we do about this? We've been in this home, we've seen these conditions, I'm not sure who to call. And, while we did, they did do a call to a general sort of, adult protective service helpline. What would have been great is if they had someone in specifically that they could have called, right? Who is cross-trained in not only adult protective services, but understanding. I mean, this was a case of abuse, but it was, secondary to having a serious, mental, serious and persistent mental illness. She didn't mean to torture these animals. This is when it wasn't a deliberate act, but an artifact rather of her mental health problem, which not only was it creating problems for the animals, but was also creating problems for her. She wouldn't turn her stove on. Because of, and, it wasn't as though the delusional, the paranoia and the delusional behavior was just specific to the cats. For the next person, this is a trickier one because you're working with a dyad here. And you're just going in to get paperwork, but you're finding out about this. So I am not a clinical social worker. So I can't say that I mean, this actually was a commitment. This is part of the commitment report because B's behavior became so dangerous that actually Elle called a crisis center and they sent someone out and they filed the commitment procedure. It's just that the animal piece came up as they were sort of building, they were talking about the reason for this. Now in Pennsylvania, it's danger to self or others. We typically think of it as danger to other humans, but one could broaden that to other living beings. And I would argue that we should, right? The bird one is again, this is so common. I mean, we've encountered this a great deal when you're going into homes of older adults. And so here's someone who just really needs, like this actually happened to me personally with my mother-in-law who, pretty much wanted to live her own life and live until she couldn't live in the house and things were really bad. And there was an elderly cat who had been her sidekick for many, many years. And so, when we were able to get into the house, we were able to see not only the condition of my mother-in-law, but also of her animal, right? And so we did, we addressed both my mother-in-law as well as her beloved companion. But, it was I can't say there was a happy ending here. She did go in the hospital, she did get an assessment. The animal, of course, could not come with her. So we took care of the animal until it was her time. But, not every family will do this. And so I think if you're intervening in this case and, she asked about her animal a lot. So it continued to be a touch point for her, even though she could not have that cat in assisted living. And then the very last slide is one I encounter a whole lot working with a rescue called Pittsburgh Hill District Cats. We have a lot of older adults whose purpose for living is the community cats. And so, but what we find is when we are working with them at just trapping and releasing, and by the way, there's a big spay-a-thon going on. So shout out to Humane Animal Rescue for having the spay-a-thon today, because a lot of the rescues are doing TNR. But they go in and they find this and they'll say, I'm not sure what to do. They actually will, sort of talk to each other, but wouldn't it be great if we had, again, a place where they could call, be it at a rest, to say, I'm not sure what to do, but we've trapped these cats and we've tried to manage the colony, but we're really worried about this older adult who's living in a place that doesn't have heating or feels unsafe. You're not going to go in there like gangbusters and change everything, but it's important to have someone who can have a conversation. And myself, for this person, I had a nice baseboard heater that I was able to get, and then was able to open the conversation about adult protective services. And sometimes people get warned not to, because like they'll come into your home and they'll take you away. And so trying to talk through, that you're still in control, but living in this trailer in the winter with no heat, that isn't something that the trapper or rescuer felt comfortable doing, but having a social worker or a liaison that they could have. I only found out about it because I'm on that Facebook page, but it would be great to have people who actually are trained to do this, who work in adult protective services. So I think that that's it. I'm taking us to the end here, and we're going to have, Janet has this beautiful professional picture, and then there's me, like in my ratty work clothes with my cat. Janet, I have to get a headshot like that. So I want to thank you all for today. We're going to open it up for some questions. I think Vicky and a couple other people have been keeping an eye on the chat and with the question, if you've posted in the chat, I'd appreciate, please, when we ask you to respond, if you could take yourself off mute and do that, we really appreciate it.
Mary, can I just throw in, this is Vicky. Thank you all for participating in this really wonderful expose on so many angles of elder and animal bonding and abuse. But I do want to point out there's been a lot of great links that have been put in the chat by the presenters. And if I can ask the presenters to send them to me afterwards, I will include them in the post-seminar email you will all get with a link for the recording of this that will go on for another month. Some of you have asked about that in the chat. So thank you all. That's it.
Hi, everyone. We thank you for coming today, and we hope you enjoyed this presentation by the Keystone Link. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars.
Is there anyone who has a burning question? We still have a few minutes left. We're very happy to answer it.
Grace, this is Nancy. I'm just going to put out to all of the presenters, as you're talking, and especially about the need to find resources and things like that, the idea of, maybe state by state or some way having more collaboration, more hotline of some sort, where an individual, let's say like some of the couple of the examples that you used, where they come into a situation, their older parent or older relative is not doing well. You have the one who calls, they suggest to get an ambulance, but then nothing is said about the birds. I wonder if there's, some way to have more of a centralized resource that can then funnel those issues to the right places. I don't know, it seems like it might be a little kind of unwieldy, but it's just kind of the thing that popped into my mind.
I mean, that would be a great idea. As I said, because of some of the rescues I volunteer with, I'm on their pages and they use that. Having a central, and Janet probably, she works with Open Doors, can say something. I do want to say one thing before Janet talks, is that I make it a point to talk to any older adult. And I also have we have a resource guide that you probably got when you got the invitation. In there are ways to talk to people about their pets, particularly older adults, like the 80-year-old who wants to get a puppy, or the older person who's like aging with their animal in place, like my mother-in-law. Talking about what you need to open the discussions early and continue to have them as circumstances change. So, this grandson knew there were birds in the home, but he never opened the conversation about it. And I do think they maybe are hard conversations, but I think they're very necessary conversations to have with people. So Janet, you probably, as the access person, probably have some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm actually just putting in the chat here. So Pet Health Finder is a national database, so you can search by zip code, and what will pop up, there's sort of three buckets. There's temporary pet fostering, there's accessible and affordable vet care, and then there's pet food and supplies. For a situation like the bird, both the vet care and the temporary fostering would be places to search. If there's not anything that comes up there, then unfortunately, it's not funded to anywhere near like, 211, where you can either search their database yourself or call 24/7 and get somebody to help connect you to resources. But there is an email for Pet Help Finder that is staffed, and with the national connections and network for all three of those kinds of help, the Pet Help Finder staff can then assist that provider if there's like the bird situation that was shared. So I love the idea of having a more, like, I think the word used was routing, like a more supported way to, connect the provider to the service. And I definitely, think that things are headed in that direction. But in the meantime, here's Pet Help Finder. And again, if the search, it's national, and then by national I mean there's locally, you'll get like local, state, and national resources to assist, and it's growing constantly. So it was launched, and it's still being continually updated. So if you know of anything that's not in there, if you search and are like, wait a minute, our community has X, there's no cost to list, there's no cost to use. The whole purpose is just to help people and their animals to stay together.
I want
Thanks,
to add
Janet. We'll have to, figure out a way to make that more public.
Yeah.
I'd also like to add to Janet's, the worst possible, scenario for, me, is when you have an emergency, right? And unlike maybe child welfare, and yes, there was a comment when you go into the home, when I went in the home, I'd be looking for evidence, just not of children, but also evidence of pets, right? And sometimes you have to remove children quickly, and therefore you have sort of an emergent pet situation. But in the case of aging, and I'm not someone who works in aging, but if you have a relationship with someone, you can begin those conversations early. And right now, I am the power of attorney for two older women who live in two older women that I became connected to, and they have no family. And so I am power of attorney for their cats. So like, I don't recommend people necessarily do this, but I have found that it not only eased their mind, but it's allowed them to go get the needed medical care. Now, I would really love to see this be something that just not someone like me volunteers to do, but until that happens, I would say absolutely talk to your clients that you're working with about who has, is there someone you can give, power of attorney to in the event that you have to go into the hospital. Or I cannot tell you how many requests we get, speaking as a volunteer, as a board member for Hill District Cats, about like my family member died, my family member went into nursing home. Clearly, these things were happening over time, and no discussions happened about the animals. And while these are painful discussions, they are absolutely necessary for the peace of mind of the older family member, not to, and of course for the animals. So there, in the guide that that Vicki will send you, it says aging in place with pets. There is a power of attorney form in there that was created by a pet law professor, but it's specific to Pennsylvania. So, that can be used. There's also some things like that. There's also some aging resources in there about these kind of emergency situations. So.
Yeah, and just to build on what you're saying, Mary and Maria, what you just put on in the chat. So I do come from the aging perspective, and we for a long time it's been talked about the need for caregiving conversations and caregiving planning, and to have those conversations as early as possible, and when you can express what you want as best as you can. And so having those conversations as early as possible in your relationship with the client too can be important. But also, pets are an underutilized part of like a caregiving network. I think anyway, that's one of
Yeah.
my things I'd like to look at more because, pet care is not as intimate or complicated in some ways as a lot of caregiving tasks are, like bathing a loved one, taking care of medications. Those are really, you know, you want someone you really trust and know. And some people want a stranger, but there's just, a lot of vulnerability in the way that there isn't with pets. And, a neighbor can come in, a neighbor can be the person who's on call to take care of a pet if someone needs to go into an emergency room or a hospital. The a neighbor, even like a grandchild or a younger person, I would entrust, and I have entrusted my 11-year-old neighbor with caring for my pet while I'm away, but I'm not gonna entrust that kid with caring for my dad. And it's not because I don't value my pet. It's just I feel that he has that level of responsibility because he's also done it himself. And so pets are also a way of thinking about a support network in a different way than we tend to, and maybe opening up that network and expanding it.
That's a great point. I mean, I do think that pets are not necessarily utilized to that degree, Jess, and I really encourage us to think about that. In as part of an expanding network. So anyway, other questions. We have 5 minutes remaining. So and estate planning again brings up a really important point. One of the things, remember, in Pennsylvania, pets are considered property. So if there is no will, then those pets are sort of, in limbo. So if you have a will, or if you're working with people creating wills or estate planning, that should be considered. Because of the property piece, I mean, you can talk, I'm not an estate attorney, so I won't want to practice law here, but I mean, they are considered property, and so they need to be considered in long-term planning. Yes, actually, Hazel, I'll just say my daughter's a nurse, an ICU trauma nurse, and she has quite a few older adults who feed community cats who come in and they've, broken their hips and they want to sign out AMA and not go to rehab to take care of their cats. And, like, I think at times she's threatened to restrain them to keep them in. I was like, no, that's not good nursing practice. But, she has, reached out to the social worker or to me to say, what can we do? They won't go to rehab. So, who can, and oftentimes, again, the informal network will help in doing that, just like you have done. So that's exactly right. And so that way, the human can stay and heal, and the animals can be cared for. But and sometimes shelters will even, I know the shelter that I volunteer at, we've been known to, with permission, drive to people's homes and, take care of the animal for a period of time until we can get something set up more permanent.
Yeah, and one of the things I saw in that study there were 3 participants. I mean, that's 3 out of like 460 people, but 3 people shared a story with they had taken on a client's pet. And one of them, it was someone who the man would not go into an assisted living facility or nursing home until he knew that his dogs were taken care of, and that person took on that dog. And she mentioned too that she'd done that like 5 times, and certainly that's not best. No one's going to make that best practice.
Yeah.
And it's definitely outside of your lane.
Yeah.
But it just it further illustrates that the pets really shape decision making,
Yes.
and that unless those plans are in place, and a lot of people will go without for themselves. So And it
Just
also
wanna-
acknowledges the work that people do going above and beyond what they need to
Yes.
or it's supposed to. So that should also be acknowledged.
Yes, and I just want to add the staying in our lane. I think the issue is much more of us not asking about animals. That's absolutely part of our lane in terms of the human side of the human animal dyad, and for all the reasons we've talked about, we need to be able to first of all just be recognizing and then responsive. No, we're not veterinarians, we're not animal trainers, most of us anyway, so we don't have professional expertise in that, but just like we would help somebody with the utility shut off, their hot water tank broke, maybe you do know how to fix it, but you're not going to probably go in there and you find like a community resource to help support them in something that's in that case it's a basic necessity. People's relationships with their animals, many folks consider them family members, very important support relationships for them, or they're caregiving and they find that them going. So it's finding ways to support people's relationships with their animals as strengths, and then helping to reduce the stressors with resources. Those are very much in our scope. When I was talking about staying in our lane, I was with emotional support animals. I've seen people write like Fluffy is amazing and a wonderful support animal for Janet Hoy Gerlach kind of thing, and that may be absolutely accurate. But if it's contested and you've written like anything that sounds like an assessment or an evaluation of the animal, what I don't want you to experience is I've served as an expert witness for years for the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division on emotional support animal cases. And all that I've served on have been discrimination, that the person was illegally prohibited from bringing their ESAs. But the opposing side will look at the letters and try to, pick them apart. So it would be, let's say I wrote one and I said great things about Fluffy, they would be, pushing at me, well, how are you trained to evaluate animals? What are your qualifications? How do that kind of grilling? So when I was talking about staying in our lane, I was more specifically thinking about, ESA letters, but of course, generally, that just helps to protect us. If we have professional training for it, then, that's in our scope of practice, and we can, you're getting professional training today. So you just broadened. So that's fantastic. But yeah, just with the letters, most of us don't have professional qualifications to evaluate an animal. So, however, we, the human side, that's what the letter is for, and that's what we do. So that's.
Well, everyone, I think Liz is telling us that it's time for us to close this really enriching conversation. I would like to thank Jess, Janet, and Mary for their participation today, as well as all our friends at Talkie Tech and Vicky. You're wonderful in terms of getting everyone here in the forum to have this important discussion. So if you have any further questions, there's information and emails in the chat box, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.